Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, as an all-encompassing response to the question, what do you fly? I am going to be walking you through step by step how to build my go-to freestyle setup to the level of detail where hopefully, even if you're just a complete beginner who's never built a quad before, you can follow along with these steps. You can get in the air and fly my favorite quad setup. Before we get into it, however, we need a couple disclaimers. For starters, I'm not an engineer or an expert builder in the world of FPV. However, below I'm putting several playlists of resources that I used in the last couple months to learn how to do all of this. And hopefully in combination with this video, you'll be able to figure it out. For the most part, I've covered everything you need to know to actually physically build this quad. The only two things that you may need to look into further is one, how to solder, and two, how to bind your goggles and your controller to the drone once it's built. As for the soldering, there are so many resources out there, and there's a great Joshua Bardwell video below that basically tells you everything you need to know about soldering as a beginner before you start building your first quad. So I would go there before you even watch the rest of this video if you have no idea how to solder. Also, luckily the stack we're using in this build comes with a practice soldering board, so you can actually practice on that before you start building with your real electronics. As for the second half of my disclaimer about binding your controller and your goggles to your quad, I just really want to make it clear that when you start in this hobby, the computer side of things can really be the most difficult, and getting things to work in the software of the drone takes a lot of research and patience. So if you're new to all this, just hang in there, and there's so many people in this hobby who will be willing to help you figure it out. Also, my channel's small enough to where I can respond to all DMs and comments, so just leave a comment or message me over on Instagram with any questions you might have about the build, and I will try my best to either answer them or find someone who can. But if you're a beginner and this is your first build and you're down to give this a shot, then the most important link below is a Google Drive document that I've made that lists out absolutely everything that you need to buy to get started. And just to be upfront about costs, this is not the cheapest way to get started in FPV. Instead, this is a high quality freestyle setup that can take insane hits and carry an action camera at speeds of around 80 to 90 miles an hour. The entire list of things used to build this quad on the Google Doc, including the goggles, controller, soldering iron, and all the peripheral things like batteries and the charger, it all comes out to around $1,400, which isn't that much in the world of drones, considering the fact that Mavics are around $2,000, and even with DJI's FPV drone, if you crash that, you have no way of fixing it. And I know they have a replacement program, but even then, it's a limited number of replacements, and if you crash a build that you made yourself, you might only have to replace an arm or a motor, and that'll only be 20 bucks, and you'll be up and flying within the same week, and you'll have way more confidence to learn cool tricks because what's the risk? Since I'm showing you how to build this, we need one last disclaimer, which is please be safe. FPV drones are a lot of fun, but it's still a heavy piece of carbon moving through the sky at a high rate of speed. So make sure you're always being safe and responsible and following all the regulations and laws that are in your area. So with all of that said, we can finally get started with this build. Alright, so this is everything that you're going to need for this build. Let's go through the parts one by one. So first up, we have the Mamba F722 stack, the Flash 2207 1950 kV motors. I usually fly slightly bigger motors, but for freestyle they've been a little OP, and now that I fly the GoPro Mini, I want to try the size that I flew to begin with, which was the Xylo 2207s on the Bardwell. So we're going to give these a try. And after the motors, we have my least favorite part, which is the ELRS receiver, specifically the EP1 Dual, our good old O3 Air unit, which costs a pretty penny. And you might be noticing that the cable on my Air unit has less wires than normal. That's because I cut the S-Bus wires, which is the yellow and brown ones, because the receiver we're using won't work if those two are connected, so you can just get rid of those to begin with. And then we have our O3 antenna. You can use the stock one, but this is one that FlyFishRC sent me, and it's extra long for better range. And last but certainly not least is the Volador 2 frame, which comes in this little cardboard box. And now that we've gone through all the parts we're going to need for this build, let's clear off the workspace and start from the beginning, because it's about to get chaotic, so the tidier the better. Alright, so once we empty this box, this is everything you're going to find inside. And first we have our 3D printed TPU parts, then the hardware bag, which has all the little bits and bobs and screws that you're gonna need for this build. Then we have the left and right camera plate, and of course, all of the carbon that we're gonna need to build the frame itself. This helpful little diagram of where everything goes, our battery pad, the wire tracks, and the battery straps themselves, one long and one short. So let's once again clear off our workspace and lay out the carbon that we're gonna need to start building this frame. Building the frame is always such a fun part of every build because in such a short period of time, you go from having nothing to having something that kind of resembles a quad, all thanks to this pile of carbon right here. And the first part we're gonna need from this is that big long base plate with the X in the middle. It looks like this. And it's not the one that has the silver inlays in it, that one's coming in a sec. First, grab this gummy that came with the battery strap and flip it upside down. This piece does a lot to dampen vibrations from the insane maneuvers that we're going to be putting this thing through, and that helps further isolate the gyro and the flight controller and make it fly better. And now we have to grab two things from our hardware bag, which is these cone washers and the M3 16mm screws. You're gonna need 4 of these. Go ahead and give each of these screws their own washer and make sure that the head of the screw is flush with the edge. And now we're gonna pop these bad boys through the holes that are closest to the edge of this little X. This is where we're gonna slide our arms on, and we're gonna make sure that the triangular part of each arm is flush with each other so that it all lines up with this X in the middle. That's the perfect size for our carbon key. The tolerances on these parts are really tight, which is a great thing, but if you're having a little trouble getting this on, just add extra pressure and it should pop in place. And now we get to use the fancy looking plate, which has a specific orientation with the little hexagon cutouts at the top. You don't want to put it on the bottom because the standoffs lock into those little hexagon holes. So let's leave it at this orientation, and we're just gonna plop that down right on top of the arms and screw that all together. Oh, and when you're doing this, don't crank it down as tight as possible because that's gonna be a pain when you're trying to put the other parts in. Just for now, get them tight enough so they're not going anywhere. And look at that, that's starting to look like a frame. And I must confess something, I feel a little bit like a traitor because usually I use the tropical TPU because I like that it looks like a fish. In fact, I have 3 Voladors and it's on every single one. But this time I decided I'd do something different because they sent me black TPU, and since the motors are also black, it might be fun to just have a murdered out look. Of those TPU parts, the first ones we're gonna need are these 2 little squiggly pieces. They're gonna fit between the 2 plates that we just put on, and once you start messing with it, it should become clear which one's left and which one's right. And these prints aren't gonna hold themselves in place, so once they're situated, we need to grab the M2 12mm screws, and we're just gonna need 2 of them. They're gonna be screwed into these holes right here into a threaded insert that's on the other plate. I really like this part. I think just like the gummy in the center of the frame, it's a nice little balance between soft mounting, but also keeping it really rigid. And look at that, it is already time for the standoffs. To do that, all we need is our M3 16mm screws and our M3 23mm hex standoffs. These little guys are super convenient because they're just gonna fit right in these hexagon cutouts, and that's gonna keep the standoffs from rotating freely when you're screwing or unscrewing your build. So go ahead and do that for all 4 standoffs. It's the same for each one. And next up, we're gonna do the stack screws, and then it's really gonna start looking like a quad. The stack screws are gonna be your M3 28mm screws. You're gonna need 4. Oh, and also you're gonna need to grab the other 4 cone washers. Slide those onto your stack screws the same way you did it with the others, and we're gonna put these on the 4 outside holes because we have a 30 by 30 stack. And once you screw all these stack screws through to the other side, now is actually a good time to go through and tighten everything that we've put on so far because we're not gonna have to go between these 2 plates for the rest of the build. And now take a moment to admire your fine work. Alright, enough of that. Now it's time to keep going and put on the 3D printed arm guards. You'll find them in this bag with the antenna mount. They look like this. And the way they work is pretty simple. They just snap fit onto these triangular holes on the ends of the arms, and they are super important. They let you do stuff like this. Alright, we'll fly later, but let's get back to this build because next we need to work on our XT60 and antenna mount, and that looks like this. If you'd like to build a quad with GPS, I'm sorry, I have no idea how to set that up, but that's the part that you would need to put the module. For now, we're just going to use a simple antenna mount, along with the M2.5 standoffs. These little guys are going to be press fit into this print, and it can be a little bit tricky because again, the tolerances are very tight. But if you're having trouble, I recommend just using a flat surface like the table and pressing down really hard with both thumbs, and they should go in real easy. Now you'll notice that there is a little bit of standoff sticking out above the print. This is actually normal because the XT60 has hex cutouts on the underside, and that helps it all fit together super snug. So go ahead and grab the M2.5 screws. You're gonna need 2 of them, and we're gonna go ahead and screw this in from the bottom like so. Oh, also, if you're wondering why I'm using a freaking prop tool for this, it's because I snapped my 1.5mm driver, so life sucks. But once that's all plugged in, unfortunately, now we have to worry about electronics. Dun dun dun. And we're gonna start with the ESC, so you can take that out and start taking off the stickers. And we're gonna put it on with the metal side up. But before we do, go ahead and grab the blue gummies that came with this stack. Get the one specifically with the lines in the middle, and you're gonna push these through. I like to use a hex driver to do this. But you're gonna push these through so that it soft mounts on the stack screws. Unfortunately, I somehow lost the blue ones that came with this kit, so I'm just going to use these other black ones that I had lying around from another stack. And they look like this when they're on. Now grab the O-rings that I listed in the beginning, and we're going to put these on the bottom of the stack screw to give a little space between our ESC and the carbon plate at the bottom, because if you don't know and you are truly a beginner, the carbon conducts electricity pretty dang well, and you can short your ESC on it and the whole thing will go up in smoke. So these are really important. And now we get to put on the motors, so go ahead and unbox these, and you can just throw away the cardboard. You're not going to need this. There is a little hardware packet inside each box, so you can just go ahead and empty each of those baggies, because you're going to need 4 of those screws for each motor, as well as the prop nut. Then put the prop nut on for safekeeping. I like to do this because I have nowhere else to put it, and we're going to go ahead and start screwing these motors onto the arms. And if you've never done this before, don't worry, it's also super easy. It's just 4 screws and 4 holes per motor. Once they're all on, it should look something like this. Before we solder all these on, let's go take a look at the XT60 connector and make sure, of course, that you have red to positive and black to negative. Go ahead and grab your flux and apply it generously to the pads, and then we're gonna add a big old glob of solder. I don't know how much I have to explain this because I'm not doing an in-depth soldering tutorial, but if you are really concerned about this part, Bardwell of course has an awesome tutorial on this, and even the part in his Bardwell DIY kit when he does the battery lead is gonna be a huge help on this part. But once you complete this step, now we're gonna take a look at how this XT60 goes onto the standoffs. And this, much like the other parts, can be quite the tight fit, so if you can't get it in with your hands, I recommend using the flat edge of a tool like so, just to sort of really press that down and get it seated well. And now we will prepare the solder pads for the main battery lead on the ESC itself. And unfortunately, this is the part where the more experienced viewers of this video will realize why I'm not giving a soldering class. Even though it's probably a skill and experience issue, let's just chalk it up to the fact that I bought the cheapest soldering iron that Amazon has to offer. But turning our focus back to the build, just make sure you're really careful about the length of wire that you're cutting here, because it can be a real big pain if you cut it wrong. Another thing to keep in mind is you want the portion of wire that's running between the ESC and the XT60 to lay flat on the carbon, because you're going to be mounting the O3 air unit above this lead, and it's a lot easier if it's nice and flat. But once you've completed the battery lead, now we have to tin the solder pads for the motors. And then we need to grab our adhesive wire tracks, and we're going to be feeding the wires through before peeling off the plastic and sticking them down onto the arms. Now that everything's situated and all the motor wires are stuck down in the wire tracks, we need to do the same thing for the motor wires that we did for the power lead earlier, which means we have to run each motor wire to its respective soldering pad so that we can roughly measure it, cut, and strip it for the soldering process. I know I'm not really doing the most in-depth breakdown of how I'm soldering the motor wires to the ESC, but once again, I've left some awesome resources in the description that taught me how to do this and honestly are a little more eloquent than I could have ever explained it. Once you finish the motor wires, go ahead and grab 2 pieces of the wire that you cut off and the capacitor from the Mamba stack box. To solder this, all we have to do is strip about a 1/2 inch off the end of each motor wire. Once it's stripped, go ahead and make sure that it's going to be long enough to reach across the ESC like so. Then all we have to do is wrap the stripped end of each wire around the little metal prongs on the capacitor like this, and add a bubble of solder to this connection point so that it doesn't come loose. Compared to the rest of the soldering in this build, this part's really easy, and all you have to do once you do that glob is cut off the excess prong and do that with the other side. The most important thing now is we need to make sure that when we solder it to the ESC, we do negative to negative and positive to positive as indicated by the symbols on the side of the capacitor. These two wires will be running over the flight controller because there's not enough space between the two boards, and it'll sit like this behind the camera by the time all is said and done. Before we leave the capacitor alone, we need to make sure that we wrap it in electrical tape so that we insulate it from any potential shorts that may happen with the carbon. I like to wrap my electrical tape a few times around the cylinder vertically, and then for good measure I take another section of electrical tape and wrap it around horizontally so that it doesn't come loose. And with that, there's only one thing left to solder, which is the Express LRS receiver. The way we'll solder this up is black to ground, red to 5 volt, yellow to TX, and white to RX. These are going to be soldered onto these pads on the left side of the board. Using the wiring diagram that came with your stack, make sure that you're wiring TX to RX and RX to TX. I know it's confusing, but that's how receivers work. Now we can take the antenna that came with our radio receiver and run the connector side up through the bottom of the frame between the power lead wires. If you're having trouble getting a firm grasp on it to push it through, a pair of tweezers should definitely do the trick. We'll connect this antenna to the receiver in a bit, but for now we need to just run the pointy ends of the antenna through these two holes in the TPU parts that we put on the bottom of the frame earlier. That's going to keep it from flopping around while we fly. Now we need to grab the antenna for our air unit and run these connectors through the antenna hole at the top. This is going to be a really tight fit, so if you need to unscrew the standoffs to get a better look underneath the power leads, go ahead and do that. This is another instance in which tweezers will really help. Now grab the antenna nice and tight, and we're going to press fit this into the TPU part like so. This can be super tight, but just wiggle it around and be patient and it should go in just like this. If you did unscrew the rear standoffs to help with this process, now would be a good time to screw those back in. So just to recap, this long one's for your radio and these two short ones will be for your air unit, which we are going to install now. Which we will begin by removing the 4 Phillips head screws that are on the bottom of the air unit pictured here. Once you've got those out and stored in a safe place, grab the air unit screws and the support pillars from your hardware bag. They look like this. If you feel like the bottom cover of your air unit is going to come loose because it's unscrewed, you can use a piece of electrical tape to hold it in place like this for this process. So now let's put the air unit screws through these 4 outside holes. And once they're through, we're going to put the support pillars on those screws, leaving it looking like so. Now we can gently lower the O3 air unit on, lining up all 4 holes on the bottom with the screws, and go ahead and screw it down. To connect the antenna, we need to take off the UFL cover using these 2 screws. In retrospect, you may want to do this before actually screwing the air unit onto the frame, but you can still do it like this if you accidentally followed this tutorial to a T. Sorry. With a little pressure, these should snap in just fine. Just make sure that the wires aren't running in some weird way or have big kinks, and then you can replace the cover right back to where it came from. And now finally, you can plug the air unit into the flight controller just like so. Up next, we'll reach into the Mamba box and grab this cable. This one's going to connect the ESC and the flight controller, and it has a little sticker with an arrow on it that will point towards which side to plug into the flight controller. And now we can mount the flight controller on the stack screws before moving on to attaching our antennas to the radio receiver. First, go ahead and connect the antenna that's been hanging out behind the air unit, and then you can grab the other antenna and connect it as well. For now, this is just going to hang out while we figure out the camera mount, but in the end, this is going to be its orientation. Now go ahead and grab the TPU front bumper, and that's just going to slide on nice and easy like so. Now go ahead and grab both camera plates, which are labeled L and R in case you get confused on which side they go on, and also grab these gummies. I'm going to go with the black ones since it matches the rest of the TPU I'm using. You can push these into place like so on the camera plates, and then we're going to grab the screws that came with the camera on our O3 air unit. For the mounting of the FPV camera, we're going to use the bottom hole and the back curved hole, and we're going to put those screws into these 2 holes on the side of the camera. For this step, remember that you don't really need to crank these screws in all the way. That's just going to be a pain for when you have to mount the camera plates, and also it's going to defeat the purpose of soft mounting the camera for vibration dampening. Once all 4 of these screws are in, let's prepare the frame for the installation of the camera plates using these little triangle carbon pieces that will fit in these slots right here. That'll look like this. Now we can push the camera plates down and grab our M3 8mm button head screws to screw them in from the bottom. If you're having trouble lining up the screw holes, you should loosen the camera screws for more play and try again. Now we can grab the M3 nylock nuts, and these are going to go on our stack screws so that we can keep the stack in place while we fly. When you tighten these down, don't crank them super tight because you don't want the boards to touch and end up shorting something and destroying valuable electronics. Now grab a small section of electrical tape, and I like to hold the front radio antenna onto the capacitor like so with this little section of tape. This will keep the antenna firmly in place after we run the pointy ends of the antenna out of the bottom triangular holes on either side of the camera plates. We can use another small portion of electrical tape to keep the receiver in place on top of the air unit so that it doesn't wiggle around and cause gyro issues in the air. Alright, now pause. Before we put the top plate and the props on and actually go outside and fly this thing, we need to do a couple things on the computer to actually make sure it can get in the air. First, you're going to just need to grab a USB Type-C, and we're going to plug that in right into the USB-C connection that's on our flight controller. So first things first, let's just update the firmware on our flight controller. And the way you'll do that is you just hit update firmware, and then I just go hit auto detect, and it'll bring up your stack. Make sure that the most recent version of Betaflight is selected. I just leave all these options here. I hit load firmware, and then once it's loaded up, I hit flash firmware. Pretty simple. There we go. All right, and it should say programming successful. So now that that's done, we can go hit connect, and it'll say there are some custom defaults for this board. You can just apply those. It'll come up with some warnings, so there's no motor output protocol, and the accelerometer is enabled but it's not calibrated, so we can fix those. All we have to do to calibrate the accelerometer is set the drone down on a flat surface. I'm gonna use the floor. And then once it's still and stable, we're gonna hit calibrate accelerometer. So then we go down to the motors tab, bada bing, and where it says ESC motor protocol, let's go ahead and hit D-Shot 600. Then we're gonna hit bidirectional D-Shot, hit agree, and now we'll hit save and reboot. At this point, we'll go ahead and do our motor direction. So what we want to do is grab one of our lipos, it's beautiful. Once the battery's plugged in, we can go ahead and connect back to Betaflight. Now go back down to the motors tab, and we're gonna hit reorder motors. Click I understand the risks, the propellers are removed. Just follow the instructions and go ahead and click on the spinning motor. And then hit save, and it should reboot the and then hit save, and it should reboot the flight controller. And what it's doing here is it's just making sure that the flight controller knows which motor is motor 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's entirely going to affect which motor it gives power to when it's trying to adjust itself in the air. Alright, now let's hit motor direction. You can hit that and then hit wizard, and then hit start and spin motors. Make sure nothing's gonna get caught up in them. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the arrows and making sure that the motors are spinning in that direction. In order to do that, you can either just touch the motor to be able to tell, or you can use something like a piece of paper to just hold up to the motor and see which way it pushes it. If you see a motor is going in the wrong direction, go ahead and click on the number and it'll flip it around and make sure it's going the right direction. 4 is wrong, 2 is wrong, 1 is wrong, and 3 was wrong. Once you've made sure they're going in the right direction, go ahead and click stop motors, and then we can close that. And if you tried to fly it like that, it would have just pushed itself into the ground excessively hard, and it would be an absolute disaster. So, important step, don't forget it. And now we can unplug our battery because we won't be needing it. Oh gosh. Brand new XT60s are so tight. Okay. Alright, at this point, the next step is to configure your radio receiver, but unfortunately, that's the part I know the least about. However, I can tell you a couple important details that you'll need to know to follow other tutorials to set it up. First, go ahead and make sure that in your ports tab, you set UART1 to serial RX, and you can do that with this button right here. Next, we want to go to the receiver tab, and we're going to make sure that our receiver is at serial via UART, and then under serial receiver provider, we want to hit CRSF, which stands for Crossfire. Next, make sure that you have telemetry enabled, and once you select all those options, we can go down to the bottom right and hit save and reboot. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you do set up your receiver, make sure that the device target you use is the Happy Model EP1 Dual 2400 RX. And I recommend watching the tutorials that show you how to set it up over Wi-Fi because that tends to work way better than Betaflight pass-through. Again, those will be in the description, and if you've never used ELRS before, Just know it might be a little bit of a pain, but it's how you're gonna get the most bang for your buck. And luckily there's a lot of really informed people that can help you out all over the internet and on the Express LRS Discord, which I'll also link below. Once you've figured out your receiver and you've bound your controller to your drone, and you make sure that you have all your inputs being picked up, also make sure that you set up the modes in the modes tab, the most important being arm, because that's what we're gonna need to actually spin up the motors and get to flying. Now let's go over to the presets tab. Here we're gonna do two simple things. We're gonna hit this OSD preset that says OSD for FPV.WTF, DJI-O3, and Avatar HD. We're gonna click that, and we're gonna use DisplayPort and MSP VTX on UART3. And then we want to go over to the Superfly FPV Freestyle 5-inch preset. We're going to hit 6S LiPo with HD camera. And then we're going to get rid of the pre-selected 4S preset. We're going to leave RPM filtering checked. And then making sure that the packet rate on our radio controller is at 250 Hertz. Let's select that option. And if you want to mess around with freestyle rates, you can do that. Once you have all those options selected, go ahead and hit pick. It's going to give you a warning that it can only work with D-Shot 600 or 300. Luckily we're using 600, so that's not a problem. Hit agree. And then you can hit save and reboot, and it's gonna add both of those things to your flight controller. And then go down to the OSD tab, and then just make sure you have everything check marked on your screen that I have right here. Also, I like to move these OSD elements to the top left of the screen. Once you click all of those things, we can hit save. Oh, also in the configuration tab, make sure that your maximum arm angle is at 180. Otherwise, it's gonna be a pain and you won't be able to do turtle mode and get yourself out of general trouble. So go ahead and make sure that's at 180. Also, really important note, I don't know why it did this, but on the receiver tab where it says stick low, stick center, and stick high threshold, you'll want to make sure that it says 1050, 1500, and 1900 in that order. And that'll look something like this. I just tried to do an arming test myself and found out that it was at 0, so it was never going to let me arm thinking that my throttle was through the roof, because that would make our quad go to heaven. So anyways, if your arming says it's disabled because of throttle, that's probably why, and I would go check that. Alright, with all those setup steps complete, let's finish this build and get it in the air. Now let's grab our M3 8mm screws and our M2.5 9mm screws. This is how many you'll need of each. Also, let's go ahead and grab our battery straps for this step. We're going to place them leather side up like so, and we're going to keep the buckle nice and close to our electronics so that we can really tighten those batteries when we get them on. And now it's finally time to grab our top plate and firmly press it on. Once again, with tight tolerances, the XT60 plug may take a little trying, but with a little pressure, it should snap into place. And now we'll go ahead and take our countersunk M3 screws, and we're going to put them in the countersunk holes that are on our top plate. The M2.5 screws will be going next to the XT60 plug like so. And since we'll be filming with a GoPro, we can grab our GoPro mount bag that came with the kit. And this will include screws with a wider head so that it really grips onto the TPU. All 4 of these screws will go directly through the mount, through the top plate, and into the camera plates. Now let's grab our battery pad, being careful to remove the adhesive covers so that you don't just take the adhesive off of the battery pad. And we're going to stick it right here so that our batteries don't slip when we strap them on. Oh, also, the screw and nut that came with the GoPro mount, I recommend just screwing that on now using this hex cutout, and then just screwing in from the other side. It's good to just have that there for safekeeping, because otherwise you might lose them, and that's annoying. And with that, the only thing that we have to do to prepare for a hover test is put on the propellers. So go ahead and take the prop nuts off, and then the way that we've oriented our motors is props in. So make sure that the pointed tips of the propellers are pointing in towards the stack like so. Once they're on, we can use our prop tool to tighten these down as much as possible, and after that, even though it sounds crazy, this thing's ready for a flight test. So let's pack our stuff up and go out to the field for the moment we have all been waiting for. Alright, so let's start this out with a hover test, and if we're gonna do that, we need to strap up our battery. And I found that the quickest and safest way to do this with this battery is to put the balance lead up between the two wires used for the XT60 connector like so, and then we can slide it into the battery straps with the XT60 wire side up. And now just absolutely crank that Velcro as tight as you can make it, and it should look something like this. So now when we plug it in, all we have to do is give that XT60 connector a little twist so that it keeps the balance lead in place, and just plug it into the top plate, nice and easy. If your controller is now saying it's connected, we can do our first hover test. And during this test, all we want to do is gently go forward, backwards, left and right, and all the while being ready to disarm at a moment's notice in case things start to get out of control. And if your quad responds normally to all of your inputs and you survive this step, it's time to put on the goggles and get in the air. For my flight footage today, I'll be rocking the GoPro 11 Mini with no protective TPU, which, as I said in the Google Doc, is a little dangerous for intense freestyle, but we're keeping it chill. So fun. It's good stuff. What can I say? It's good stuff. I think that's all. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that flying footage. I told myself I was going to be nice and gentle since it's just a test flight, but I couldn't help myself as this thing feels incredibly smooth. And so of course I had a couple great crashes, but as you can see, it's like nothing ever happened. And that's the advantage of building your own drone, is these things are built to take insane hits, especially the Volador, which is particularly heavy and durable. I hope you guys had fun watching this video, and if you're still watching, huge thank you. You've made it a long way into this video. This build was a lot of fun, but honestly, after editing most of it yesterday, I don't know when the next time I'm gonna do a full-length build video is. It takes an insane amount of time. My respect for YouTubers like Joshua Bardwell have gone through the roof seeing how long that takes. So of course, under special circumstances, I'll probably be making another build video soon. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you followed along with this build and it was your first ever build or even your 10th build, please feel free to DM me flying footage or just pictures of the setup, because it would be so cool to see that anyone followed along. So for next week's video, I'm gonna be putting this thing through its paces with a lot of rough freestyle at some crazy new spots. If you like this video a lot, please consider checking out and subscribing to my Patreon. I post a lot of behind the scenes over there, and I also write the names of all my Patreon subscribers on my radio so that you show up in every single one of my daily posts on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube Shorts. And if you don't have the means to support me on Patreon, please consider subscribing. It's free, and I come out with a new YouTube video every week. And now that that's said, I am definitely tired of talking to the camera, so that's about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.